HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Being Social, The Philosophy of Social Human Rights. Edited by Kimberly Brownlee, David Jenkins, and Adam Neal. Read by Danielle Cohen and Alex Wyndham. Introduction. Kimberly Brownlee, David Jenkins, and Adam Neal. Certain rights are essential to a minimally decent human life because, when these rights go unmet, human life becomes unbearable. This pioneering collection of original essays explores the social dimensions of that minimum. The essays investigate the nature and force of our interests in decent human contact, acknowledgment, social inclusion, connection, relationship, intimacy, and shared ways of living, as well as our competing interests in solitude and associative freedom. The category of human rights which encompasses these various interpersonal and social interests is called social rights. The essays subject both enumerated social human rights and proposed social human rights to philosophical scrutiny, and probe the conceptual, normative, and practical implications of taking social human rights seriously. The human rights that protect our interests in shelter, food, health, education, culture, and community have long been seen as the poor cousins, or even false relations, of the human rights that protect our interests in physical safety, due process, political participation, and freedom of movement, speech, and belief. Indeed, even though many of our socio-economic rights are enumerated in key international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, some thinkers maintain that these rights are of a different, logical category from the paradigms of civil and political rights, and the attempt to incorporate socio-economic interests within the respectable concept of human rights has left it muddied, obscured, and debilitated. Some thinkers hold that access to education, food, health services, work, and culture is best thought of as a desirable goal or a liberal aspiration, rather than as things to which we can have human rights. The reasons given for questioning the credibility of such rights include that they are simply unclaimable, or, if claimable, are overly demanding, that they are about the wrong kinds of things, because human rights are meant to protect us from oppression and not to secure for us basic material and social goods, and that even if socio-economic rights are about the correct kinds of things, many of them secure far more than the brute moral minimum that is the proper purview of human rights. In 1977, Karel Vashak branded socio-economic rights as second-generation rights, a very stubborn and unfortunate mislabeling that both misrepresents their long history, which includes their figuring in some versions of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and implies that they are lexically inferior to so-called first-generation civil and political rights. That debatable ranking is reflected in the different levels of urgency expressed in the two international covenants. The ICCPR, the covenant that enumerates civil and political rights, commits state parties to a demanding standard, specifically that they respect and ensure to all persons subject to their jurisdiction the rights recognized in that covenant. States commit to adopting the laws and other measures necessary to give effect to civil and political rights. By contrast, the ICESCR, the covenant that enumerates economic, social, and cultural rights, commits state parties to a modest, progressive realization standard, specifically that they take steps, individually and through international assistance and cooperation, to the maximum of their available resources, with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant. Whereas the ICCPR insists on implementation here and now, the ICESCR expresses no such insistence. Significant inroads have been made over the past 30 years to defend the credentials of our economic welfare, or material rights. Comparatively few human rights scholars still question either the right to be free from poverty or the rights to education and health, narrowly construed. And most human rights scholars and institutions acknowledge the truth of Henry Shew's powerful observation that all human rights make both negative and positive demands of duty-bearers, which can require significant resources. In other words, we cannot divide human rights neatly into so-called liberty rights and welfare rights. All human rights have a welfare element that requires positive action from duty-bearers, and many so-called welfare rights, such as education and health, are the foundations upon which liberty is meaningfully exercised. Shew's seminal contributions to human rights debates have shown just how vital specific rights, such as subsistence and security, are to the realization of less contested rights, such as due process, political participation, and free thought. Without adequate nourishing food, potable water, physical security, and decent shelter, we will struggle, if not fail, to exercise any rights requiring the exercise of clear thought, given the mental and physical deterioration and risk of early death that our deprived situation will produce. To put it bluntly, due process, free speech, and political participation are of little use to us when we are on the brink of starvation. In view of the foundational role that rights to security and subsistence play in realizing other rights, Shew describes these rights as basic rights. The argumentative inroads that human rights theorists have made on behalf of economic welfare or material rights, whether or not theorists regard them as basic in Shew's sense, have not yet been systematically made on behalf of our social human rights. This collection takes a first step towards remedying that neglect. Shew, for his own part, had not explored prior to the publication of this collection the vital role that our social connections play, particularly in childhood, in securing our other human rights. In his chapter here, Chapter 1, Shew makes a notable contribution to human rights debates by expanding his conception of basic rights to include our interests in social inclusion. He utilizes Elizabeth Ashford's method of identifying a basic right. That is, would a person forego any other right to secure the right in question? And he draws on empirical literature to show that opportunities for social contact, inclusion, and enculturation are vital for the development and maintenance of our cognitive capacities. Indeed, without the development of such capacities in childhood, the very concept of personhood is threatened. For this reason, Shew says that the right to have adequate social opportunities during childhood is more basic than basic. He submits that any guardian acting on behalf of someone threatened with the loss of such opportunities would surely sacrifice any number of civil and political rights to avoid it. That said, development is not more important than maintenance. Each is as fundamental an interest as there can be. Together, our development and maintenance interests in social inclusion comprise a double-barreled, basic right. The general theoretical neglect of social human rights to date is mirrored in human rights practice. It is noteworthy, for instance, that the 2015 UN Sustainable Development Goals do not include a goal specifically related to our interpersonal social interests, and none of the 17 goals have targets explicitly related to social interests, though various indicators of progress gesture towards social integration and related values. Much attention is paid within the goals to our basic material interests, which attests to the growing awareness of the importance of these interests, but also confirms that our social rights have been the poorest of the poor cousins. The relative neglect of social rights within the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals is more surprising than the sidelining of these rights within the human rights tradition that grew during the second half of the 20th century. This is because, over the past few decades, with social psychology and social neuroscience taking the lead, we have become more aware of both the fundamental importance of our social interests and the extent to which our social, political, and material interests are intertwined. A person with insufficient material and temporal resources cannot be hospitable to others, cannot be a hands-on caregiver, and cannot meet their own needs or their dependents' needs for social contact and community. This has ramifications not only for their social interests, but also for their material and political interests. A person who must dedicate most of their time to working and commuting, or who lacks the money to join in social or political activities, will be marginalized within their community and more vulnerable to compounding and corrosive forms of disadvantage and injustice. Lacking adequate material resources can also be a source of shame for people, especially when this prevents them from clothing and presenting themselves in a way that is deemed to be socially acceptable by society. This kind of shame can lead those who suffer from it to isolate themselves, which further harms their social, material, and political interests. As this indicates, social rights protect us not only from ways that we can be harmed as social beings, but also from other forms of disadvantage and harm. Sociality and core social interests have received attention within related conceptual frameworks, such as the capability approach, advanced most famously by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which offers a less individualistic, but nonetheless human rights-friendly vehicle with which to defend core social interests, including our needs for shared ways of life and shared ethical outlooks, emphasizing as it does the vital importance of both individuals and groups having meaningful freedoms and opportunities to realize core functionings, such as those related to sociality. Nussbaum identifies 10 central capabilities which all democracies should support. 2 of these capabilities are explicitly social, namely affiliation and emotions, and several others on her list are implicitly social, including senses, imagination and thought, other species, play, and control over one's environment. The affiliation capability focuses on being able to live with and toward others, recognize and show concern for others, engage in different forms of social interaction, and imagine another's situation. Protecting our capability for affiliation means enabling us to engage in various forms of social interaction, a crucial part of being human, It also means protecting institutions that constitute and nourish important forms of affiliation, such as the family, but not only the family, and protecting freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. The emotions capability focuses on being able to have attachments to people and things beyond ourselves, to love and be grateful to those who love and care for us, to grieve when we are separated or when we lose those we love. This capability also includes not having our emotional development blighted by fear and anxiety. In general, then, supporting this capability means supporting forms of human association that can be shown to be crucial in the development of these emotions. All that said, not all social human rights are equally marginalized within human rights theory and practice. The standout exceptions are the rights that protect marriage and family life, the rights that protect religious practice, and the rights that protect freedom of association. These social rights enjoy a much firmer theoretical and legal position than do other social rights. Their comparative security is due in no small part to the fact that they have been enumerated in international agreements officially pertaining to civil and political rights, such as the ICCPR. Also, in the case of freedom of association, our protected interests have traditionally been understood in political terms as preserving trade union rights, and also have been viewed largely through a negative rights lens, even though they, like other rights, must make positive demands on duty-bearers to ensure they are meaningfully respected, protected, and fulfilled. Freedom of association protects our rights to associate with each other and to form voluntary groups together, which serves our interpersonal needs. But, if viewed through a purely negative rights lens, this freedom does not actually give us a right to associate. It merely gives us a right not to be prevented from associating with others who wish to associate with us. It does nothing to protect an abandoned child, or an exiled person, or an immigrant with whom nobody wishes to associate, or an older person whose mobility issues prevent him from attending his local social club. The negative right against state interference also does not provide the legal, political, and social infrastructure necessary, first, to ensure that third parties honour our rights to associate freely, and, second, to give us meaningful ways to routinely meet proto-associates, so that we can form associations over time. Additionally, a freedom from interference approach to associative rights ignores the massive investment that parents and guardians must make during a person's childhood, willingly or not, in order for her to assert her freedom of association later in life. As the examples of family rights, religious practice, and freedom of association show, it is conceptually incorrect and analytically unhelpful to bundle all social human rights under the socio-economic heading, especially since that heading is weighed down by the sticky assumption that such rights do not merit the strongest legal and political protection. In reality, many social rights seem to straddle, if not dissolve, the civil-political/socio-economic divide, and also, as noted, they push against the contrast between so-called liberty rights and welfare rights. A more fruitful theoretical approach, therefore, might eschew sharp conceptual, normative, and practical divisions between different human rights in order to highlight those rights and perspectives that have been neglected in human rights debates. Of course, collapsing sharp conceptual and normative divisions will not solve all theoretical problems, and may create some new ones. First, without some kind of ranking of human rights priorities, societies will struggle to determine, and will disagree about, how to allocate their resources. A civil political lexical ranking could be replaced with a basic rights lexical ranking as a guide to societies, but that would still require some reasonably sharp conceptual and normative divisions. Second, if our interpersonal and social needs are lumped into a general category with other human rights, certain important features of our sociality might be overlooked, including the fact that, by nature, social resources such as face-to-face contact, physical touch, companionship, care, culture-making, and community building necessarily rest within us. Such resources are necessarily owned or possessed by the people and groups who offer them. In that respect, social resources are distinct from, and potentially much more problematic than, both material resources, such as food, land, and water, which can be unowned, and institutional resources, such as laws and policies, which are detached mechanisms that can protect us from oppression. Even so, many human rights securing institutions, which we do not typically think about in interpersonal terms, are in fact deeply social. Both a well-functioning police force, which helps to secure our rights to life and physical security, and a well-functioning legal system of judges, juries, prosecutors, and defense lawyers, which helps to secure our rights to due process, justice, and remedy, are social forces. They are collectives of people who, usually through face-to-face interactions, are tasked with neutralizing tense situations, defending vulnerable people, and providing comfort, assurance, restoration, and vindication. To understand this better, suppose that police interactions with the public were carried out predominantly via robots or automated systems. No longer would police officers relate to other persons on a human level. No longer would those parties realize the social value that comes from a well-functioning police service, helping people face to face. The same is true of other spheres of justice that fall within the purview of human rights. The point here is not to suggest that social rights is a capacious catch-all concept, but rather to highlight the underappreciated and ineliminable social aspects of enumerated civil and political rights. Sociability runs deep within all human rights concepts, since, at rock bottom, human rights recognize our common membership within a moral community. Third, that said, a larger concern is whether human rights norms, as such, offer a credible moral, political, and social mechanism to identify and protect our fundamental social interests. Familiar charges against human rights norms include that they are ethnocentric, culturally imperialistic, excessively individualistic, antagonistic, minimalistic, and unduly demanding of under-resourced societies, despite their claims to minimalism. By framing discussions of people's social needs and interests in the language of human rights, we may simply be repeating past argumentative mistakes within a whole new set of debates. Is it possible, for instance, that the sociable person, who is the intended subject of social human rights, is, yet again, a particular vision of the person presented in the guise of universal personhood? Concerning the demandingness and potential impracticability of human rights, James Nichol argues that we should resort to human rights talk only when some norm weaker than a right will be insufficiently effective. In addition, we should attend to the feasibility of a declared human rights norm and, specifically, whether the majority of countries today are capable of implementing that norm. In the epilogue to this collection, Nichol explores the kinds of steps that international human rights institutions might take to increase the feasibility of implementing social human rights norms. In Chapter 13, Simon Hope expresses the worry that some of the interpersonal, associative, and communal dimensions of human life cannot be adequately captured by individualism, and this is particularly problematic in post-colonial settings, where individualism clashes with more holistic local ethical outlooks, which are built around shared forms of life, including shared ways of thinking and acting. Hope's chapter explores specifically the rights of the Maori people in New Zealand/Aotearoa to use a specific form of communication with people outside their community, namely, the right to communicate their ethical claims utilizing their own ethical language and concepts. He is critical of the expectation that Maori people should use a human rights framework to communicate their ethical claims. He argues that to insist that they use this framework causes them to suffer from normative disorientation, to which human rights claims are not the solution. Hope's skepticism about human rights talk, voiced in this volume and elsewhere, offers an important counterpoint to the enthusiastic endorsements of human rights concepts found in most of the other chapters. A question that remains, however, is what kind of communicative rights of the Maori people are in play. Presumably, they are solidarity rights. That is, those collective rights or group rights, such as a group right to self-determination, which are sometimes referred to as third-generation human rights, but ones which arguably must usher human rights language from the room in order to be respected. Several chapters in this collection enthusiastically defend specific social human rights grounded in particular social interests. Some chapters focus on our social interests within our intimate relationships. Some focus on our social interests at work. Others focus on our social interests outside of our intimate relationships or work connections, including our interests as communicators and our social interests on the street amongst strangers. In a contrasting but ultimately complementary direction, other chapters focus on our interests in being sometimes left alone, unburdened by social demands, as well as our interests in having periods of solitude. These analyses, which pull in different directions and, in some cases, identify social rights that are new to the human rights theoretical literature, form one of the central contributions of this volume. Collectively, they subject a plethora of putative social human rights to analytic scrutiny, thereby advancing reflection on which rights, both familiar and foreign, are genuinely philosophically respectable. In more detail, Stephanie Collins, Chapter 2, Alexandra Kotu, Chapter 3, Kimberly Brownlee, Chapter 4, Jenny Brown, Chapter 5, and S. Matthew Liao, Chapter 6, each explore our needs and rights within some of our most intimate connections. Collins looks at a key tension in the ethics of sociability between our positive social needs, specifically our need for intimacy, on the one hand, and our need for associative control, on the other. She argues that, although each person has no human right to intimacy as such, each has a right to intimacy consideration, which gives others a duty to deliberate about her needs for intimacy and her intimacy inclinations, and to act accordingly. Collins also argues that intimacy groups have group rights to group intimacy, and not just rights to intimacy consideration, which requires others to respect, protect, and promote their group intimacy. In defending the idea of persons' human right to intimacy consideration, Collins develops her view that In light of certain problems concerning the claimability, enforceability, and action guidance of the right to goods such as intimacy, we do not have human rights to specific socio-
Sample complete. Ready to continue?